This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. And today is a very special day, and this podcast is a very special podcast. Ma nishtana ha-podcast hazeh? You ask, why is this podcast different from all the other podcasts? Well, it's because it's co-hosted by our very own, well, now she's our very own, the amazing Dahlia Scheindlin, a political scientist, political consultant, and all-round pundit, as well as a dear friend. Dahlia, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. That's the first time I've had the formal pundit title.
Exactly. And also in our studio is our guest for today, a historian of American Judaism at Yeshiva University in New York, the author of numerous books, including most recently The Jews of Harlem, The Rise, Decline and Revival of a Jewish Community. It was recently published by New York University Press. Professor Jeffrey S. Gurock, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Yes, welcome back, I should say.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so your first book, entitled When Harlem Was Jewish, 1870 to 1930, came out almost 40 years ago, but it was about the exact same topic. What happened during the 4 decades that passed that made you think that this subject deserves revisiting?
Well, it's not the exact same topic because, in fact, there are 85 more years of history that I deal with in this book. The early book deals up into the period of 1930 when Jews left Harlem. At one point around World War I, there were 175,000 Jews living in Harlem, which made it the third largest Jewish community in the United States, in the entire world, second to the Lower East Side and lamented Warsaw in Eastern Europe. So initially the book was about how Jews came to Harlem and how they ended up leaving Harlem and moving to other sections of New York City. But this book deals with additional issues, namely what is the Jewish component in Harlem's history after Jews no longer live there, whether it's the maintenance of Jewish stores and businesses in Harlem, the relationships between Jews and African Americans in theater and music and other types of things, the image of Harlem as a black Mecca and to what extent Jews are part of it. And then the book ends with the last chapter is called The Beginning of Return because, in fact, as part of the gentrification of New York City, at this point there are more Caucasians than African Americans in Harlem, and Jews are a component in that revival of the community in terms of Jewish life. So I was interested not only in talking about the early history, but the recent history as well. And if I may say one other thing, 40 years have passed since the first book. I looked at the original book, and I realized that, in math and sciences, there are people who are 12 years old and are doing differential equations at Harvard. So as a historian, the older you get, I really believe the better you get. And this book is more accessible. There are more personal stories in the book. For example, you meet my father in the book, which I wouldn't have done in my first book in 1979.
We meet you in the book, too.
You meet me in the book, right, in my family. And I talk about my Uncle Sam, Jeffrey S. Gurock. Sam is from my Uncle Sam, who was a bootlegger, and he ran with Waxy Gordon's gang. There's a show in America called Boardwalk Empire, and Waxy Gordon, there's a Waxy Gordon figure. I kept looking for Uncle Sam. He doesn't appear in the show.
But that's because he fled to Canada.
That's right, to avoid incarceration. That's correct. But indeed, it is a book which talks about the past, but also the present, and has some thoughts about the future of Jewish life in Harlem as well.
I'd like to ask you, you did say that it's a personal story, and I have to confess that for a first show, I'm going to get very personal. It's personal for me. I grew up very close to the neighborhood. Because of the revival you're talking about, I think I spent more and more time in the neighborhood. And I want to ask you, as you point out, it is called the Jews of Harlem, but it really is so much about Jews and African Americans or the Jewish and black communities in America. I think what I want to point out is that during the era that you write about, the really early years, there was so much intermingling as the Jews were still there and the African-American influx was coming in, then the exodus or the sort of slow demise of the Jewish community or exit. By the time I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I'm already dating myself, these were really segregated communities. We weren't even allowed to go east of Amsterdam for safety reasons. And there was really a sense that New York was supposed to be a melting pot, but it was really a very segregated society, even if it was not by law. Now you've talked about a revival. What do you think is the change now? Are we moving to a different kind of level of, better, more genuine, more authentic cultural blending and mixing? Could this help change relations for a new phase of Jewish-Black, relations in America, which, given all that's going on right now, we know there's a lot of tension on various levels of racial aspects in America?
Well, this is my point of view. Racism in America, in many cities, in many places, is still a profound problem for America. I believe that my hometown, New York City, and you can hear from my accent that I was born and bred in New York. It's not an accent, it's a dialect. I believe there's been a quieting of racial tensions in this city. And one of the things that I believe that I wrote about in an earlier book is that 9/11 for New York City was a moment that New Yorkers realized that we're all in it together, regardless of our backgrounds, regardless of our orientations. So I think New York City has been spared to some extent. It's the most diverse city in the country. Some of the racial tensions that we see everywhere in this country. One of the stories that I told in the book is that, and you talked about Harlem being off limits to not only Jews but whites or even the law-abiding. There's a story in the book about a classmate of mine who went to Yeshiva with me in the 60s, who was shot because he was walking across Harlem on Yom Tov, and he was an Orthodox Jew, and he didn't have any money, and he was shot for 25 cents. Thankfully, he survived. At that point in 1970, some Rabbanim, Orthodox rabbis, declared that you could carry a modicum of money on Shabbat and Yom Tov in case you were mugged in Harlem. Imagine that was 40 years ago. Now, in Morningside Park, which nobody walked into, there was Sukkah. There were Lag BaOmer Tekes in Morningside Park. It's changed a great deal. I did a personal walking tour of Harlem. I do walking tours, but for myself, I walked across 125th Street last summer, where there was a firebombing about 20 years ago, Freddy's Discount Store. And it looked like a Tel Aviv or American Mall. Red Lobster, Nike, all these outlet stores. So my point here is that New York City has been spared a lot of that. And if Harlem is any indication of where our city is going, I can't speak for the entire United States, it is a moment of harmony to a great extent. So Jews are very much accepted in Harlem today. One of the issues for me is to what extent Judaism, our faith, our traditions, our religion will be revived in this area. And that's a larger question for me and a question in terms of the survival, not of Jews, but of Judaism in the 21st century.
I want to go back perhaps one step and ask you, to what extent do you think that this Jewish revival of Harlem, again, with the limitations that should be imposed, to what extent do you think it is connected to greater demographic trends within Manhattan and perhaps New York City and perhaps the whole area and the whole country?
One of my earlier books was called Jews in Gotham, and it talked about the history of Jews in New York City from 1920 to 2010. And that was the beginning of my thinking again about writing about Jews of Harlem. And I pointed out that in the late 1970s, a time where New York City was really at its nadir, its low point, you began to see the beginnings of gentrification in Manhattan. Columbus Avenue, for example, which was a declining neighborhood, began to be revived. So Harlem is a little bit late in the game because if you go to Brooklyn, you go to places in Manhattan, it's already 20, 25 years where this gentrification has taken place. So Harlem is a little bit later in terms of developing. So why did Jews move to Harlem to begin with, just for a moment, okay? And that is early 20th century. some affluent Jews, not my family, affluent Jews moving up to north of Central Park. You get on the subway and you get downtown in 15 or 20 minutes. This same dynamic where people do not want to live in Levittown, Long Island, and ride what we call the Long Island Distressway, not expressway, into the city every day, or rapid transit, which is not rapid. The idea of living in the city and getting close to your work is something which was very attractive. So this gentrification is taking place all over New York City, and Harlem is a little bit late in the game, although I must tell you, the real estate prices at this point are growing like crazy, and people are being shut out because they priced out. They can't afford living in Harlem.
I think Harlem is even way ahead of some of the Brooklyn neighborhoods that are becoming gentrified all the time now, some of which are not so well served by the subway. And Harlem is, because it's so well served, has been priced out.
Correct.
I want to go. I wonder if we can go back to what you talked about with Jewish identity a little bit. One thing I was struck by in the book is the point where you talk about the phase of sort of panic among the Jewish community, I guess it was in the early part of the 20th century, at attempts to missionize and convert Jews to Christianity. And there was sort of a panic that this was going to happen, or was the worst threat actually just assimilation and indifference? And that, if that was in the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly during the years that I grew up in New York, we had the same panic. Everybody was talking about Jewish continuity. Is this really a threat, or is it just an ongoing struggle to define and redefine identity in multicultural societies?
So I'll risk that I'll be misunderstood here. Missionaries have been part of American Jewish history almost from the beginning, and they've been fundamentally unsuccessful in terms of numbers. And yet, in some respects, missionaries have been very good for Jewish community life in the sense that if you can evoke the image of Jews becoming Christian, people will historically speaking, have opened their wallets and pocketbooks to support innovations in Jewish education. It goes back to really the 19th century, and certainly true in Harlem, when they announced that missionaries are setting up shop on Lexington Avenue and they're converting Jewish children. It was a lever for support of things like a modern Talmud Torah, a Jewish community center, and things of that sort. We historically have lost more Jews through indifference than actually stepping up and becoming Christians. So, again, I'm not in favor of missionary work, but historically speaking, they have not been particularly effective. In fact, in one of my earlier works many years ago, I pointed out that within the Christian community, there was often criticism of missionaries. A missionary settlement house will announce, "Thank God we've converted 3 Jews this year at the cost of $10,000. And then other Christian groups said, "You spent $10,000 and you converted 3 Jews. What about the poor of your community, the poor of Christian groups?" So missionaries are a factor, but in many respects they are an opportunity for Jewish community leaders to say, listen, if you don't build this shul, you don't build this community center, we're going to lose Jews to Christianity. We lose more Jews, as you correctly point out, to indifference than we ever did in terms of losing Jews to...
I think you pointed out in the book.
Well, I pointed out, so it's my book. Fine, that's good. Yeah, I appreciate that your close reading of the narrative, right?
I think that that brings me to the next part of the question, which is what does the Jewish community do about this sort of assimilation and indifference? Again, my question is really, is it truly a threat, considering they were talking about it then, and as you point out, then they also realized that indifference or assimilation was the bigger problem. Certainly when I was growing up, which is a long time ago, and maybe now too. And where do you think Jewish identity is going in that sense, especially if there's a new sort of revival in Harlem and maybe, new forms of cultural interaction?
So if Harlem is a model, it's a model where we see Jews being accepted. And frankly, in recent days in the United States, there's been talk about the resurgence of anti-Semitism. Certainly during this last election cycle, some people came out from under their rocks, and we've heard them. My perspective is that Jews in America are secure. Jews in America are accepted, but Judaism is in great danger because, as I said to some people last evening, to some extent we're being loved to death, not persecuted. So if you look at Harlem as an example, you see all sorts of indications that Jews and blacks are living harmoniously in the neighborhood, although I must say I have great concern about the fate of the poor in gentrified neighborhoods. So you have these middle-class whites, some of them Jews, middle-class blacks, some of these blacks who are not indigenous to Harlem, but are moving to Harlem, to these beautiful brownstones, living harmoniously together. But I have concern about the poor of the neighborhood. Now, at the same time, although I'm very proud and I'm involved personally with some of the startup initiatives religiously in Harlem, in Jewish Harlem, the fact remains that the vast majority of Jews in Harlem are happy there, but their Jewishness is minimal. But it's only the beginning.
Well, I want to follow up with that identity question. I mean, I love your optimistic view, but with the recent presidential election, there's been a rise in tensions and incidents, not only against Jews, but against minorities and against Muslims. And I think, racial and ethnic minorities in America are nervous. And at the same time, before this election, we had the rise of Black Lives Matter movement. And I wonder if we're looking at the possibility that because Jews are maybe now also feeling some threat and pressure, could this lead to a new era of solidarity between the different communities like we once had during the civil rights era, where Jews remember, hey, not only were we once persecuted, we may also be in the future. We should be working more actively together with other, communities in America, whether it's blacks or Hispanics or Muslims. You had this movement of Jews saying on social media, we're going to register as Muslims if there's a registry. Could we be seeing a new kind of, revival of that social solidarity and civic activism and civil rights approach as part of the Jewish identity?
Right. Well, my take on black-Jewish relations historically, and now this book really deals with almost 100 years of this, one of the points I try to make is that there's never been one Jewish voice or one Jewish attitude towards African Americans and vice versa. The valences may change over the course of time. So at this point in time, yes, I think there are Jews who see this revival of solidarity with African Americans. Many other American Jews are very apathetic along those lines. Those who are supportive of Trump within the Jewish community, and again, I'm a bit of a historian, not a political scientist. I'm not exactly sure what their motivation is. I hope it is not racially tinged. I think it has a lot to do with two things. One, like many Americans, they're disaffected with the performance of both major parties, and I think there's also their thought that perhaps the Trump administration would be better for Medinat Yisrael. I am singularly unconvinced of that. I think we don't know, they don't know, and I don't think he knows what he's going to do as far as those things are concerned. I want to get back to the point that if we look at Harlem Black Jewish experience, there's never been one Jewish voice, and there's been no one African American voice along this time. If you have a moment, I just want to tell you a quick story as to why I got involved writing Black Jewish relations. So I was a student at Columbia University, late 1970s. And as a New Yorker, I grew up during the era of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel and Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, the lamented 3 civil rights workers who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi in the summer of 1964. I also lived through the teacher strike in Brooklyn, where Jews and blacks were at loggerheads. So I wanted to write a dissertation called Jews and Blacks in the Age of Jim Crow, 1896 to 1954. And one of my professors, who happened to be an Israeli, Tzvi Corey, the late Tzvi Corey, said, if you want to study Jewish-black relations, you should study not the leaders, not the rabbis, not the politicians, but where Jews and blacks lived.
Where they meet.
And he suggested I study 4 cities: Baltimore, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago. Had I listened to him explicitly, I'd still be working on that first book to this day. Yeah. And I looked out the window. I really looked out the window of Columbia, and what did I see? I looked down the bluff, Morningside. There it was. It's an aha moment. So, as you know, the book is about black-Jewish relations, but it's also about what it means to be a Jew. And this goes back to your point. What does it mean for a Jew to leave the hub of the Lower East Side and move out of the neighborhood to a new neighborhood? What does it mean in terms of Jewish identification, Jewish life, Jewish experience? So the first book was about Jews and blacks. This book is more about Jews and blacks because I'm dealing with the era where Jews don't live there anymore, but their businesses are there, and they're involved in the media, in the theater, the music. I had to educate myself about Al Jolson and Fanny Brice and all those other types of performers and their interaction with African Americans. So it was quite an interesting trip for me this time.
If I may take an outsider's view once more, I'd like to ask you about. You said that Harlem and the Lower East Side were two of the biggest Jewish communities in the world at the time. And my question to you: why did Harlem relatively sink into oblivion, whereas the Lower East Side is put on a pedestal as perhaps the quintessential Jewish American experience?
And the Jewish conscience is right. I mean, nobody thinks about Harlem as part of the Jewish history except for your
yes,
book.
When I tell people I've written about Harlem, Jewish people, they say one of two things. One, did Jews ever live there? Or
so it's not just me then.
Or my Bubby and Sadie live there. I'm glad you're writing about it.
Right.
After World War I, Jews move out of Harlem and they move out of places of Brooklyn because the city of New York begins, for a variety of reasons, to build new neighborhoods, and Jews flock to those neighborhoods. Why the Lower East Side is maintained? Well, it's still the poor area, so Jews continue to come into the area and settle on the Lower East Side. But it also maintained its Jewish businesses, its Jewish theaters, its synagogues, and the like. And yes, it has always been the iconic Jewish neighborhood, so it maintained that significance that, again, Harlem never had. I do walking tours of Harlem, and I show them churches which were synagogues that weren't maintained. And fortunately for me, on one block, 116th Street, between 5th Avenue and 6th Avenue, I imagine Israeli listeners won't know this, but Americans might know this. I was very happy that one of the churches was not torn down to make way for a gym or a spa, things of that, because I didn't want to have to say, where that gym is, there used to be a church which was, in fact, a synagogue. But if you go with me to these tours, you'll see the iconography of the neighborhood and the fact that it still has this resonance. But you're right, the Lower East Side is interesting. The Lower East Side is the iconic Jewish Mecca. What is the iconic African-American Mecca? It's Harlem. Putting those two stories together has made this sort of intriguing to people in a variety of different ways.
Mm-hmm. All right. And on this note, Professor Jeffrey S. Gurock, historian of American Judaism at Yeshiva University in New York. And, of course, we encourage all our listeners to sign up to your walking tours of Jewish Harlem. Sounds very interesting. Next time I'm in the Big Apple, I'm sure to attend. Thank you very much for joining us today and talking to us about your new book, The Jews of Harlem, The Rise, Decline and Revival of Jewish Community. It was recently published by New York University Press.
Well, thank you very much. All Jewish roads lead to Lower East Side and
to Harlem.
And to Harlem.
Yeah. All right.
And it's really worth doing that. I'm going to make a pitch for your walking tours because it's a beautiful neighborhood. And I think also we can point out that the physical landscape in some ways shapes the dynamics because, as you point out, the book has a lot to do. It's almost like, just to flatter you for a minute, it's almost like reading de Tocqueville, sort of combining the political and sociological elements of American society with the natural beauty of the landscape. And you've got the park, Morningside Heights, with that where you can kind of that separate between western and eastern parts of Manhattan, and where people live has so much to do with the landscape, but also the sociological dynamics that go along with it.
So if you have a moment, what you don't know about me is, in addition to being a historian, I'm also an athlete, and I've been a marathoner. So I've run 14 marathons, and
I've got to catch up.
The last marathon, I jumped into the race towards the end of the race with a friend of mine who was running his last marathon, and I picked him up at 119th Street and 1st Avenue in El Barrio, and we ran through Harlem. And at one point, my friend who had run 19 miles says, "Jeff, please shut up. Stop talking about Harlem. We're running, not talking about history." So those two things come together very often in my life.
You really can't talk after a mile 19 at all.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
All right. And this runner that you just heard is Dahlia Scheindlin, my co-host for this podcast.
So you didn't know about me.
Thank you very much, Dahlia, for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and it's been great.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcast and take your pick. Also, check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Gilad_Halpern. I tweet mainly about the review, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
כשהרוח שורקת של לילה ישן. עצובה במעלית היורדת, עצובה במעלית העולה, עצובה